During a fiery live TV debate, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez unleashes a furious tirade at Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani over his rigid socialist policies and perceived impracticality. But just when the audience thinks Ocasio-Cortez has the upper hand, Mamdani drops one sentence that leaves her stunned and changes the entire tone of the confrontation. This jaw-dropping moment is going viral for all the right reasons. The bright studio lights buzzed as New York tuned in for what was promised to be the most anticipated progressive wing political debate of the year. Assembly member Zohran Mamdani sat calmly at his podium, hands folded, face composed. Across from him stood Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, eyes blazing with fury. "Your legislative agenda," she began, her voice sharp as steel, "has been nothing but a performative protest against progress. And you, Mr. Mamdani, you're the smiling face of that legislative deadlock," the live audience murmured. The tension in the room could be cut with a knife. Mamdani didn't flinch. Ocasio-Cortez leaned in, slamming the table. "You stand there acting like you care about working-class New Yorkers while blocking necessary compromises to actually deliver results. You're a fraud wrapped in socialist politeness." The host tried to step in, but Ocasio-Cortez wasn't done. "You're not fit to serve when you prioritize purity over people." Mamdani took a deep breath. He didn't speak yet. The camera zoomed in on him. New York held its breath because everyone watching could feel it. Something was about to happen. Something big. And whatever it was, it would change everything. The silence after Ocasio-Cortez's tirade hung heavy. Zohran Mamdani looked at her, not with anger, but with something deeper. "Pain," he finally spoke. "I'm not surprised you're shouting, Congresswoman," he said softly. "That's what people do when they're hiding something." Ocasio-Cortez's lips curled in confusion. Mamdani leaned forward, voice steady and clear. "You've stood on stages like this for years, pretending to fight for the working poor and rent burden. But what about that Manhattan real estate trust? The one your campaign advisor helped set up, which secretly buys up rent-stabilized buildings, then flips them after forcing tenants out through predatory fees?" Gasps filled the room. The audience, the host, even the cameramen froze. Ocasio-Cortez's eyes widened for just a second. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Mamdani continued, "Calm as ever. You called me impractical, but you sold hope to desperate families and cashed the checks behind closed doors." A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the audience. People didn't know this side of Zohran Mamdani, the quiet man who held truth like a scalpel and used it only when necessary. And in that moment, the entire energy of the room changed. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's lips trembled. She looked toward the host, desperate for a lifeline, but there was none. Zohran Mamdani stood slowly, not to shout, but to be heard. "For years, New Yorkers have begged for honesty," he said. "Not shouting, not grandstanding, just truth." He pulled a folded paper from his suit jacket and held it up. "This is a sworn affidavit," he said, "proving you used a blind trust to invest in funds that specifically exploit loopholes in the very rent protection bills you champion. These are homes once owned by teachers and service workers in Queens just to resell their leases for massive returns." Ocasio-Cortez tried to deny it. That's not true." "It is," Mamdani said calmly, "and your signature is on the commitment letter." The studio went silent again, but this time it was not tension. It was grief, not for Mamdani, but for the lie that had just shattered. A young girl in the audience clutched her mother's hand, whispering, "Mommy, why is the lady crying?" And she was. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was crying, not for what she said, but for what she never thought would come out. And New York was watching. Tears streamed down cheeks across the state because the quiet man they once underestimated had just stood up for all of them. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez tried to recover. She forced a shaky smile and raised her voice. "You're twisting facts, Zohran. This is political theater." But the audience wasn't clapping anymore. Mamdani turned to her with a calm sadness in his voice. "No, Congresswoman, it's not theater when families are driven out of their homes. It's not theater when essential workers sleep on couches while their former addresses end up in your investment portfolio." She blinked hard, like holding back a storm inside her. "You once said you fight for the little guy," Mamdani continued. but your hands wrote checks that stole roofs from their heads. A man in the front row lowered his head. His eyes welled up. His wife leaned against him and whispered, "That was our apartment back in 20." The cameras caught it. Millions watching from home caught it too. Ocasio-Cortez tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. This isn't the full story." Zohran Mamdani didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because for the first time, the truth was louder than the anger. And in that moment, the city felt something real. Justice wasn't yelling. It was calm. And it looked like Zohran Mamdani. Mamdani reached into his suit pocket again. "This is a letter," he said gently, "written by a 12-year-old girl from the Bronx." He unfolded the paper. His voice softened like a father reading bedtime words. "Dear Mr. Mamdani," he read aloud, "my name is Isabel. My daddy used to own a small grocery store on the corner, but we lost it after the rent got too high because a big company bought the building. My mommy cried a lot. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez said she would help us, but she never came back." Ocasio-Cortez looked down. Her shoulders began to sink. Mamdani continued reading, his voice cracking, just slightly. "I miss our store. I miss how happy my daddy used to be. I hope someone like you can fix what's broken." The studio was silent. One woman covered her mouth to keep from sobbing. "Isabel doesn't want revenge," Mamdani said, folding the letter slowly. "She just wants a future." His eyes turned toward Ocasio-Cortez. "You took something from that little girl, and now the whole country sees it." Ocasio-Cortez didn't respond because for once there was nothing left to say. Suddenly, the screen behind them lit up. It wasn't part of the plan. A series of documents appeared, scrolling slowly. IRS filings, shell company property records, dated investment transfers. The moderator stammered, "This wasn't part of our prepared media." Mamdani stayed composed. "It's all public record, just never talked about." A headline flashed, 2018-2023, 9 rental properties acquired under alias linked to AOC's financial advisor. The room gasped. Ocasio-Cortez clutched the edge of the podium. Her face turned pale. Mamdani walked slowly to the screen. "You see this property?" He pointed to a humble building on the screen. "An entire floor of nurses and teachers lived here. After their landlord defaulted, the building was swept up by an LLC that your blind trust managed." Ocasio-Cortez tried to respond, but her voice was gone. It had vanished with the trust of millions. "We all make mistakes," Mamdani said softly, "but hiding them behind speeches about social justice is not leadership." A young man in the crowd shouted, "You took my grandmother's home." Security rushed to calm him. Mamdani didn't move. He stood like a man carrying the weight of a community. And for the first time in her meteoric career, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked truly afraid. As the documents continued to scroll behind him, Zohran Mamdani returned to his seat slowly, his expression unreadable. The air in the room felt heavier with each passing second. In the back row, an elderly man stood. His voice cracked from age, but his words echoed across the studio. "She promised me help in 2020, he said. "I was fighting the landlord, trying to double my rent. She smiled, shook my hand, then never came back." Mamdani looked at him with quiet respect. Ocasio-Cortez's eyes darted toward the man as if recognizing him. He added, "That apartment is now a $5,000 a month short-term rental. It has her investment fund's dirty money on it." The crowd gasped again, not loudly, but like a wind sucking air out of a room. Ocasio-Cortez's face froze. The host hesitated before speaking. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, do you have a response?" She opened her mouth, but her voice, so fiery just 20 minutes ago, now trembled. I don't recall that specific tenant situation." Mamdani didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply looked into the camera. "New York doesn't need perfect leaders. It needs honest ones, even if we make enemies for telling the truth." And that sentence would echo far beyond that studio. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez reached for her water, but her hand shook. For the first time, the nation saw her afraid. Not of Zohran Mamdani, but of everything finally catching up with her. The audience was no longer judging Mamdani's political purity. They were watching something else, something deeper. Pain, redemption, truth. Mamdani turned to the audience. I didn't come here to fight. I came to clear the fog. You deserve better than slogans. You deserve answers. He paused, then added, and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, so does Isabel, that little girl who believed in you. Ocasio-Cortez's face broke, not in anger, but in guilt. A tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, but it was too late. The camera caught everything. I never meant to hurt any constituents, she whispered. Mamdani nodded solemnly. But you did, and the truth is, many watching were crying too. Not because of hatred, but because they saw a community wounded. They saw forgotten faces, the tenants, the small business owners, finally being seen. And they saw a man, calm, humble, determined, standing in the fire without throwing a single punch. That's when New York realized Zohran Mamdani wasn't defending himself, he was defending them. Then it happened. Zohran Mamdani leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He just said one sentence and it shattered the silence. You built your career on their displacement, and now their stories are building mine. The words hit like a thunderclap. Ocasio-Cortez closed her eyes. She knew it was over. The host looked stunned. The camera panned to the audience, some wiping tears, others silently nodding. Even a few of Ocasio-Cortez's past supporters lowered their eyes. Mamdani didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just stood up and buttoned his jacket. I'm not perfect, he said, but I never made a promise to a struggling family that I didn't try to keep. A long pause followed. The audience rose slowly, not in applause, but in something deeper. Respect. Even the production crew stood. Ocasio-Cortez sat still, broken in spirit. Her papers, her prep, her talking points scattered on the desk like ashes after a fire. And all across New York, people started sharing the clip, the one sentence, the calm voice, the quiet truth that thundered louder than a scream. Within minutes of Zohran Mamdani's quiet yet powerful sentence, the moment went viral. Clips flooded every platform. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. A mother in Astoria watched with her teenage son and broke into tears. That's the man who fought for us during the eviction moratorium, she whispered. He remembered us. In a bodega in the Bronx, an old man paused his coffee and whispered to the TV. Finally, someone stood up to her with truth, not hate. Across the state, people replayed the moment again and again. You built your career on their displacement, and now their stories are building mine. Those words weren't just Mamdani's, they felt like everyone's. Meanwhile, in the studio, the energy had shifted entirely. The moderators changed the topic quickly, but the damage was done. Ocasio-Cortez barely responded. Her voice was soft now, her eyes distant. Mamdani looked down for a second, placed his hand over his heart, then looked right into the camera. I will not fight with insults, he said, but I will fight for every rent burden and forgotten family in this city. That sentence, too, would not be forgotten. Backstage, Ocasio-Cortez sat in silence. Her team surrounded her but had nothing to say. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. One notification. She picked it up with trembling hands. Text from Maria, field organizer. Congresswoman, we just lost 2 key volunteer groups in Sunset Park. Mamdani's words are everywhere. People are angry, not at him, at us. Ocasio-Cortez's hand dropped the phone. Her face went pale. A staffer tried to reassure her. It's just a wave, it'll pass. But she knew this wasn't a wave, it was a reckoning. Outside, Zohran Mamdani was still in the studio, talking calmly to reporters. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't gloating. He was thanking the audience, shaking hands, hugging an elderly tenant. A producer whispered, he's changing the whole narrative in real time. And Ocasio-Cortez? She sat alone now. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded note, one a mother once handed her during a campaign stop. It read, please don't forget us in the fight for affordable housing. She had. And now, Zohran Mamdani was making sure the world remembered. As Mamdani prepared to leave the studio, a man in a wheelchair raised his hand. Security hesitated, but Mamdani walked right to him. The man looked up, eyes full of emotion. I'm Ben, my daughter. She cried watching you tonight. She's 14, said it's the first time she saw a leader speak for him. Mamdani knelt beside him. Tell her, I'm just getting started. Ben shook his hand tightly. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez promised us help after our building was sold off. We lost everything but you. Tonight you gave us something back. What's that? Mamdani asked softly. Hope? The man whispered. Real hope. Mamdani's eyes shimmered. That's worth more than any title I'll ever hold. Cameras caught the moment. No podium, no suit, just two New Yorkers holding hands, bound by pain and truth. Ocasio-Cortez watched the clip later in a silent dressing room. Her staff didn't speak. She whispered to herself, what have I done? And that was when the first crack of true regret split her pride. But the night was far from over because Zohran Mamdani hadn't just defended his name. He had reminded the community of its soul. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez sat in the green room, face pale, hands trembling. Then her phone buzzed again. Caller ID Miriam, Housing Activist Coordinator, Brooklyn. She hesitated, then answered. Miriam? She asked. The voice on the other end was quiet but firm. Congresswoman, I've given your movement 5 years of my life, but tonight, Ocasio-Cortez closed her eyes. She already knew what was coming. You didn't just lose control of a debate, Miriam said. You lost people, real ones, folks who trusted you. There was a pause. You told me to believe in you, but you forgot us. He didn't. The line clicked. The call ended. Ocasio-Cortez stared blankly at the wall. Her chest rose and fell slowly. The debate was over, but something far deeper had begun. A collapse, not just of a campaign, but of a mask she had worn for years. And outside that room, Zohran Mamdani was still comforting families one by one. Not for the cameras, not for applause, but because he remembered what it felt like to be forgotten. And now the community was remembering him. After the debate, the studio opened for questions from the audience. A woman stood middle-aged with tired eyes and a soft voice. I'm not here to ask a question, she said. I'm here to say something to Mr. Mamdani. Mamdani nodded gently. Go ahead. I teach 3rd grade in the South Bronx. My students are mostly from homes fighting eviction. They stopped trusting politicians a long time ago. She held up her phone, screen shaking. But tonight, one of them texted me. He said, ma'am, that man on TV, he cares like you do. Her voice cracked. You gave them someone to believe in. The room was still. A few people sniffled quietly. Mamdani's eyes softened. What's your student's name, Bob? He asked. Deshaun. Mamdani smiled. Tell Deshaun this city hasn't forgotten him, and neither have I. Ocasio-Cortez lowered her eyes again. These weren't just political wounds. They were human ones. And every word Mamdani spoke felt like stitching back a broken community. Thread by honest thread. Then something no one expected happened. The moderator turned to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. Before we wrap, is there anything you want to say? The room froze. Cameras zoomed in. Ocasio-Cortez stared into the lens. Her voice was small. I've made mistakes. Mamdani looked over, surprised. The audience leaned forward. I was so focused on fighting the corporate landlords that I overlooked the ethics in my own corner. And tonight, Assemblymember Mamdani reminded me of that. She wiped her eye. No makeup could hide the crack. I apologize to the families I hurt, the homes I overlooked, the voices I drowned out with my own. The entire studio went silent. Then slowly Zohran Mamdani nodded, not in victory, but in humility. This is what our movement needs, he said quietly. Not perfect people, but honest moments. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. Then another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't political. It was real. And as Ocasio-Cortez sat down, tears in her eyes, one truth remained. She would never forget this night, and neither would New York. That same night, a video surfaced online, not from the news, not from a campaign. It was filmed by a retired FDNY captain named Thomas Haywood, sitting in his living room holding a framed photo of his daughter who moved away due to rising rents. His voice was rough but full of heart. I've never cared much for politics, he began. They all say the same things, but tonight I saw Zohran Mamdani stand up not just to a congresswoman, but to a system that forgot folks like me. He held up the photo. My girl left thinking this city might never change. And for the first time in years, I believe it might. Tears welled in his eyes. I don't care who you voted for. If you got a heart, you felt what I felt tonight. The video ended there, but it didn't need more. By morning, it had 12 million views. Ocasio-Cortez's team watched it in silence. No spin could undo what people now saw. And Mamdani, he never shared the video, never even mentioned it because it wasn't about him. It was about a truth that had waited too long to be heard. The next morning, a press conference was scheduled. Both politicians were expected. Only one showed up. Zohran Mamdani stood behind the podium, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but focused. The media buzzed, ready for a fight, but he didn't attack. "I'm not here to take a victory lap," he said. "I'm here because last night wasn't about a debate. It was about people, about pain, about finally saying out loud what so many have lived in silence." A reporter asked, "Will Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez be joining?" Mamdani looked at the empty podium next to him. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I hope she's somewhere reflecting, because our movement needs real reflection now more than ever." A single mother in the back whispered to her friend, "This guy, he's different." Another reporter raised a hand. "Do you feel vindicated?" Mamdani shook his head. "No, I feel responsible because telling the truth isn't the end. It's the beginning." He stepped down from the stage. No mic drop, no headlines, just a leader walking away to get back to work. Later that day, in a private room without cameras, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez requested a meeting. Zohran Mamdani walked in. No security, no press, just him. She looked up, face bare, eyes red. "You didn't have to be so kind to me," Zohran said, "but you were." Mamdani sat across from her. "It was never about beating you. It was about speaking up for the families who couldn't." Ocasio-Cortez reached into her bag and handed him a file. "These are the investment details, the ones I held under different names. I've decided to give up my stake in those funds back to the tenants and families who were displaced." Quietly, no press. Mamdani blinked surprised. "I want to start making things right," she said. He nodded. Then this moment wasn't wasted. Before leaving, she whispered, "I'll never forget what you said last night." Mamdani smiled softly. Neither will they. That room held no applause, no cameras, no hashtags, but it was a turning point, not just for Ocasio-Cortez, but for a city rediscovering what leadership could look like. Truthful, humble, and deeply human. Outside the studio, a small crowd had gathered. Supporters, reporters, onlookers. Among them was an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Her name was Ruth Callahan. She didn't have a sign. She wasn't shouting. She simply held a photograph. It was of her apartment building, or what used to be her rent-controlled home, until a shell company purchased it under a shady conversion program an advisory board Ocasio-Cortez once sat on had tacitly approved. A young reporter approached her. "Ma'am, are you here for the assembly member?" Ruth nodded. "Yes, not for politics, but for peace." Mamdani's car was about to pull off, but someone alerted him. "There's a woman asking for you." Without hesitation, he stepped out, walked through the crowd, and knelt beside Ruth. "I watched you last night," she said, voice cracking. "You said what we've all been screaming in silence." Mamdani held her hand. "You were never silent. They just stopped listening." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "You made me feel seen again." The photo in her lap trembled. "This was my home." Mamdani stared at the image, then at Ruth. "Let's see what we can do to get you back home." In that moment, a promise was made, one deeper than politics. The next morning, Zohran Mamdani released a handwritten letter to the public. Not through his press team, not in a speech. It was scanned and shared online with simple words at the top. To the forgotten tenants. It read, "I didn't come to that stage to win. I came to remind New York that truth still matters, that pain deserves to be heard, and that apologies are not weakness. They're the first sign of healing. We are not enemies. We are neighbors. Some lost homes, others lost trust. But we can rebuild both. To every family who has been lied to, stepped on, or erased, I see you. I will not stop fighting until you are heard, helped, and healed. Not because I'm an assembly member, but because I was once one of you. Signed simply, Zohran. The letter spread like wildfire. It was printed in newspapers, read aloud in classrooms, pinned to walls in church basement, in barbershops. And Ocasio-Cortez. And Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. She read it twice alone, then whispered, "He wrote what I should have." Back in Astoria, a public school held a classroom discussion. A 10-year-old girl named Ava stood up with her pink notebook. "I wrote a poem," she said shyly, "about Mr. Mamdani." Her teacher encouraged her. Ava took a deep breath. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He just stood up for what was right. He helped the poor. He helped the sad. He made the bad guys feel real bad. He said the truth and didn't lie. He made some people even cry. He gave old houses back their light and made the world a little right. The class clapped. Her teacher had tears in her eyes. Later that day, someone recorded Ava reading the poem and posted it online. Zohran saw it. He stopped everything. He smiled and his eyes welled up. "This," he said, "is why we keep going." Because the battle wasn't just about policies anymore. It was about hearts. And Zohran Mamdani had just won thousands of them. That afternoon, Zohran Mamdani visited a neighborhood in central Brooklyn, once promised revitalization funds under a local program Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez had pushed years ago. But the streets were still cracked, windows shattered. A brick wall stood tall near a closed daycare. On it, faded spray paint read, "Housing promises only." A small crowd gathered. One woman clutching a toddler said, "They told us help was coming." We waited. Then the funding vanished. Mamdani nodded gently. "I know where it went." He held up a document. "Your grant was rerouted to a property deal in downtown Manhattan under a fake LLC." The crowd went silent. Then slowly Mamdani walked to the wall. He touched the faded letters and whispered, "Let's fix this together." A volunteer handed him a paintbrush. Without cameras, without speeches, he started painting over the words. Soon others joined. By the time he left, the wall read, "Truth starts here." The image went viral, not because it was loud, but because it was real. And across the city, people whispered the same thing. He shows up. That evening, Zohran Mamdani returned to the Capitol for an impromptu appearance on a news special. The host didn't expect fireworks, but then something unexpected happened. "We have a caller," the host said. "She's requested to speak directly with Assembly Member Mamdani. She says it's personal." The line crackled. "Hello," came a shaky voice. "This is Alice Monroe. I used to work on Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's housing task force." The room stiffened. Mamdani tilted his head. "Go on." Alice sighed. "I helped process those property transfers. I knew it wasn't right, but I needed the book. I stayed quiet." "I'm sorry," she began to cry. "I just needed to say you're the first person to bring it into the light." Mamdani closed his eyes. "Thank you, Alice, for speaking up." "That takes courage," she whispered. "I believe in you now." The host had no follow-up. The line went dead. But the moment didn't, because the truth had found its way out from the shadows, one voice at a time. As night fell, Zohran Mamdani sat alone in a quiet room near the Capitol. No aides, no reporters, just silence. He had been on his feet for almost 20 hours. His hands shook slightly, but his spirit did not. The door creaked open. It was a respected DSA leader. She walked in quietly and sat beside him. "You did good today, Zohran," the leader said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Zohran looked down. "It wasn't about winning." "I know," the leader replied. "That's what made it powerful." A pause, then Zohran asked, "Do you think it really changed anything?" The leader nodded. "You didn't just expose a hypocrisy. You reminded people what principled decency looks like." Outside, the sky began to lighten. Inside, two progressives sat in silence. One older, one rising. And New York slept peacefully. Not because it was fixed, but because for the first time in a long time, someone stood up. Not for power, but for people. The storm had passed and sunrise was coming. Just before noon, Zohran Mamdani made an unannounced stop at a small town school in Long Island. It wasn't planned. No media, no flashing cameras, just a librarian who had written to his office the night before. The library was quiet, filled with dust and worn books. Mrs. Carter, a kind woman with tired eyes, welcomed him. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, trembling slightly. "I said I would listen," Mamdani replied. She pulled out a box. Inside were letters, dozens, written by students whose families had lost their homes under the controversial housing arrangement. One read, "I miss my old bed. I miss the smell of my room. Why did they take it?" Another said, "My dad cries when he thinks we're sleeping." Mamdani didn't speak. He just sat at the table and read them one by one. His hands gripped the pages tightly, his eyes glassy. He looked up and said, "We're going to change things." Mrs. Carter, now crying, whispered, "They've waited so long." Mamdani nodded. "Not anymore." That visit wasn't televised, but it didn't need to be, because in that quiet library, history shifted again. That same hour, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held a press briefing. There were no loud speeches, no defenses. She stepped up to the podium with a stack of papers. "Today," she said softly, "I'm releasing all documents related to investment purchases tied to my office or former financial staff." Gasps filled the room. "I am fully cooperating with the federal investigation now underway, and I have decided to step down from all committee roles effective immediately." One reporter asked, "Why now?" She hesitated, then answered, "Because a little girl named Isabel wrote a letter, and a man brave enough to read it out loud made me remember who I used to be." There were no follow-up questions. No one clapped. But New York watched, stunned, because when Zohran Mamdani dropped that sentence during the debate, he didn't just change the tone, he changed the course of accountability. And now even the mighty were bending to truth. That evening, Zohran Mamdani returned to his home district in Queens. A welcome event was organized, but he requested it be held not in a hall, but outside an old, closed community center that had been promised funds but remained empty. Families gathered. Many had lost jobs, homes, and hope. Mamdani stepped onto a small wooden platform. "I didn't come back as a hero," he said. "I came back as your neighbor." He looked across the crowd. "I stood on that debate stage because of you. Every hardship, every story, every truth you trusted me with." He paused, voice cracking. "And if I ever forget where I came from, hold me accountable." People cried. Some clapped slowly. Others just stood, hands over hearts. One little girl held up a sign, "I believe in Zohran." Mamdani stepped down, shook hands, hugged mothers, looked elders in the eye. It wasn't about power, it was about purpose. And that night, under an open sky, the people who had been voiceless for so long finally felt heard. The next morning, Zohran Mamdani agreed to one final interview before returning to the Capitol. It wasn't with a major network, it was with a small neighborhood paper run by a young journalist named Clara West. She nervously adjusted her mic. "Mr. Mamdani, did you expect any of this to happen?" Mamdani smiled gently. "No, I expected to be insulted. I didn't expect hearts to open." Clara leaned forward. "When you said that sentence, you built your career on their displacement, and now their stories are building mine. Did you plan it?" Mamdani paused. "No, I felt it. I saw the faces in my mind, the broken homes, the empty chairs at dinner tables. That sentence wasn't mine. It belonged to the people." Clara looked down, wiping away a tear. "One last question," she whispered. "What do you want history to remember about this moment?" He thought for a second. That it wasn't about taking someone down. It was about lifting a community up. And with that, the interview ended. But the impact was just beginning. Back in the Capitol, Zohran Mamdani returned to his office. His staff had set aside a room, walls covered in handwritten letters. They came from everywhere. A boy in Bushwick wrote, "Thank you for saying something for my mama. She still cries when we pass our old apartment." A single father in Jamaica, Queen said, "You made my daughter feel safe again." Even a retired teacher wrote, "I didn't believe in politicians, but I believe in you now." Mamdani sat in the middle of the room and quietly read each one. Tears slipped down his face, not from sadness, but from something deeper. "Responsibility," he whispered to himself. "This isn't just a turning point, it's a promise, bro. And then he stood up, walked to his desk, and began to write replies, not emails, letters, one by one. Because if they took the time to believe in him, he would take the time to prove them right. It had been less than 48 hours since the debate, but across New York, something had changed. Not because Zohran Mamdani shouted, but because he listened, spoke truth, and stood with the broken. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez disappeared from headlines. The investigation would continue, but the city's eyes had shifted to the man who never asked for attention, but earned it. A clip of the debate now had over 90 million views. The moment Zohran dropped that sentence had become something more than viral. It had become timeless. People didn't just remember it, they felt it. And somewhere tonight, a child went to bed believing again. A tenant smiled for the first time in weeks, and an old woman in a wheelchair whispered, "We matter because of one man, one voice, one truth." And now to everyone watching this story, you. If Zohran Mamdani's courage touched your heart, if his words reminded you of someone you love, drop a comment, share your story. Let the world know you still believe in truth. Click like if you felt even one tear during this video. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel where real stories still live. Let's keep the truth alive together.